All right, so, I think I got this up and going the way it needs to. All right. A couple of things. First off, remember you've got a quiz coming up on Friday if you're here. If you're not here, you will need to log in and take it over the weekend. You should be able to do that. I set the date parameters to start Friday and end Monday. So unless something bizarre happens with Eduphoria, it should work all weekend. So you'll need to be sure if you're not here that you log in and take care of that. There is an honor statement at the beginning of it. If you're one of those people well, everyone will actually have to take it, but but for you people in class, it's less meaningful than for people taking it at home. Anyway, so be sure you do that. This is the end of kind of the lecture portion for this quarter. So, Anna, you don't have to be so excited. Everybody say hello. We're being recorded. Say hello.
Hi.
Yes, okay. This is 2A. 2A is always they're always the recording victims, I think. So we'll finish lecture today, then the quiz is Friday. Then when we come back, don't forget you'll have the writing journal to do. So one thing you need to be thinking about is taking a look at, what that writing thing is and maybe start kind of prepping for that, because otherwise, you're going to come in on that Monday after spring break and be like blindsided, right? And so and the benefit to this is the way the prompts are structured, they will cover material that you're going to need to be covering for the midterm anyways, right? So while you are essentially preparing for two different aspects of a midterm test, you're still looking at the same material. So that's a good thing, okay? So be sure you're familiarizing yourself with the prompts, choosing which one you're going to do. Start prepping yourself for that. Remember, you will not use notes. You'll have to do it off the top of your head. But you have plenty of time to study and prepare for it. I am working on the midterm. I'm almost done with the first draft of it. Right now it's got way too many questions. I've got to pare it down. I'm thinking I'm going to have it around 85 questions, and you'll take that on Wednesday of whatever date that is, the 16th or something like that. So that's the plan for the week after spring break. So just be prepared. It's not that you have major stuff to do over spring break, but if you have big travel plans, you need to be making allowances for the extra stuff you need to be prepared for. Yes, ma'am?
Are you going to release the review test?
I am going, though, I can't. I hadn't thought of that. What I'm going to do after I finish making the midterm, I'm going to come up with a review, kind of a topical review, and I will think about releasing the tests. The dicey part with that is I have to be careful how I do it, because I can't do it in a way that makes it accessible to the World Wide Web. It has to be accessible only to specific people, which I could probably solve that by putting it into Google Drive and requiring a Sunnyvale ISD login. So I might try to do that, but that will take me a few days. In other words, what you need to be looking for over spring break is that kind of information being released from me, okay? Because I'm not going to get it all pushed out to you this week, right? It's going to be happening. I'll be pecking away at it over, I'll have it done before the end of spring break, so it's not like I'm going to be releasing it the Sunday before you come back, but it's going to take me a few days, so it'll probably be over the course of this weekend. But I could probably do that. I don't think that would be a problem. That doesn't mean that the questions are identical, but that will maybe help you practice and kind of think in terms of that. Because I'm using the same testing program to create the midterm. What I'm doing is I'm setting the parameters. And what I've been doing is going to like two of our test banks and pulling questions, because there's two test banks that tend to have harder questions. What I'm doing for the midterm is I'm setting the difficulty level at medium, and then I'm just going through and picking the questions I like. So there may be some questions that are duplicated, and then there may be some questions that are different, but they're all going back to the same standards, right? Because what I'm doing is I'm going through the standards list, and I'm saying, okay, well, we covered the Great Depression, we covered, imperialism, and I'm clicking on those standards, and it's putting a whole list of questions that have to do with that. So if you look at the old tests, that'll give you kind of an idea of where the test banks, in the plural sense, tend to focus their attention. That's not a guarantee of what the answers are going to be, but it would help give you a focus. So yeah, I think I can probably do that. And I'll either share it through Google Drive or I'll put it into eCampus or something like that. So be looking for a Remind. That's how I will be sure and let you know. So if you haven't signed up for my Remind, you need to do so. And all that information is on my webpage. Okay? So go to my webpage for that. And then this will be shared through my YouTube channel. So again, you can go to my webpage, go to Learning Resources, click on my YouTube channel, and there you go. If I get a chance, I'll try to put it into eCampus too. But that's a multi-step process, and again, all of that stuff takes time. You know, and that's always in short supply. So anyways, I'm going to backtrack a little bit, mostly because I think it's my 4A class didn't get quite as far as you guys did, and since I'm recording this for 4A, plus it's not going to hurt. We were covering this very quickly at the end of class, so it won't hurt to kind of revisit some of this stuff. So I want to point out that that you kind of have to keep the chronology and the politics in mind when you're thinking about the New Deal. Because you've got the 1932 election, right? And when Roosevelt takes office in 33, you have that first 100 days, that flurry of activity where he's passing all this legislation, right? We get 15 pieces of legislation passed. We start addressing the banking crisis, which is the most pressing concern, because remember, we have everybody freaking out over the gold standard, going off the gold standard. And so we start addressing that, kind of creating stability in the banking system. We start addressing the stock market and some of the problems with the stock market. And then the next thing he turns to is how do we resolve the unemployment issue? How do we resolve the economic crisis? And that is a response where he's going to start creating jobs. That doesn't mean there's zero direct relief, but it means that the preference for the New Deal is going to be in job creation. Again, remember that there's a very different premise with the New Deal. You have the safety net premise as opposed to the shelf premise when we get to the Great Society programs of the 1960s. And that's an important distinction. Now, again, people criticize like Social Security because they say this is the beginning of big government and government doing stuff. It is the beginning of big government. This is the beginning of a new relationship of the American people with government. Government has a role to play in regulating things, not just in the way we saw regulation of the Progressive Era. We did see increased regulation in the Progressive Era, but that was regulation designed to create fairness in competition, right? So that you couldn't have Standard Oil driving out all of their competitors, right? It meant to guarantee that our food supply was safe and healthy, right? These are things that are regulation, absolutely, but they're not trying to moderate everybody's lifestyle, essentially. What you have with the New Deal is the next step of kind of this progressive government regulation, which says, okay, the government's not just going to regulate things, we're actually going to interfere in people's lives. Now, I say interfere. Understand that the Social Security tax is something that they force people to contribute to, and they force companies to contribute to. You don't have a choice. I can't say I don't want to contribute to Social Security. Well, actually, technically, let me rewind that. If you're a teacher in Texas, you can say you don't get a choice. I mean, I still don't have a choice, but in Texas, we have a retirement program that's an acceptable state version of Social Security, right? Which actually is not always very fair to teachers in Texas, especially if you've done both worked outside of education and you've worked in education. It's all kinds of craziness. Anyways, without jumping off on chasing that rabbit. What you see happening here is that Social Security is the government coming in and saying we're going to be responsible for the welfare of a segment of our population. Now, yes, arguably it's a vulnerable segment of the population, and a segment of the population that probably deserves a safety net, okay? But it's definitely a new relationship, and it's definitely the government coming in and telling us what to do. And this is why you're going to see that there's actually a recession within the Depression, because they start pulling these Social Security taxes out in 1936, and we haven't fully recovered from the Depression yet. So what you're essentially doing with Social Security taxes is pulling people's money out, okay? And I think I've just jumped ahead of myself. Anyway, so understand that the 1934 midterm, you have 32, we have this flurry of activity of trying to create jobs, the CCC, the WPA, NERA, the NRA, the AAA, the PWA, all this kind of stuff, right? We have all these jobs programs being created. Understand that some of those are more successful than others, like the CWA gets killed because it pays way too much money. And there's a difference between the ones that have direct government employment and the ones that work through contracts, okay? And those distinctions are probably not incredibly crucial for you guys in a survey class. I just kind of want you to be aware that there's differences. So, and when people analyze the New Deal, understand that it's more nuanced than just, oh, well, it's direct relief versus nothing, right? Okay, there's a lot of nuances to the New Deal. So we get to the 1934 midterm elections, okay? Democrats win very, very, easily, right? You have a Democrat dominated Congress, you have a Democrat president, and FDR sees that as basically a reinforcement that the American public likes the New Deal, and that's probably an accurate assumption, right? Generally speaking, midterm elections are seen as kind of a temperature gauge of how the public likes what the president's doing. Which is why in 2010, when the Republicans took over Congress from Obama, everything went kind of crazy because very clearly people weren't happy with what Obama was doing, right? So in 1934, we have an attempt at another 100 days. Now that's not quite as successful. We don't have 15 pieces of legislation getting passed, but we do have some big pieces. Now, if you remember, FDR's been facing some criticism. That was one of the things that we ended with at last class. He's facing criticism from the conservative right side that say, oh, you're spending too much, the deficit spending is stopping growth, we're having too much regulation, businesses can't grow and develop. And then you've got people on the other side that are saying you're not doing enough, right? We need to redistribute wealth, we need to nationalize the banks, we need to tax the rich, we need to create a Townsend plan. We have all these things in place. And so a lot of what you see after the 1934 election, so this would be 1935, is going to be pieces of legislation like you see up here that are intended to really kind of, not to the same extreme that his critics were suggesting, but certainly you can see where he's targeting some of these accusations that we're not doing enough. So you have that being a big impact. Wagner Act, be sure you understand. One of the things that will happen in 1935, remember that the Supreme Court has declared the NRA and the AAA unconstitutional. And so the Wagner Act is meant to kind of come in and tie up some of those loose ends because the NRA was declared unconstitutional. It strengthens unions in a nutshell. And that's probably the most important thing you need to know. So you definitely have, during the New Deal, new strength going to unions. And if you think about the trajectory of unions going from after the Civil War, kind of how they emerged to kind of give workers a voice in the grand scheme of this massive industrialization, where businesses were really dominating everything. So unions come in to give that voice, and then they kind of struggle, right? Their success ebbs and flows based on the nativist reaction, based on the economy, based on immigration, based on who's in charge of the government. When you have Teddy Roosevelt, he's more friendly towards unions, and you see union growth kind of being a steady kind of increase. Whereas by the time you get to the 1920s, thanks to high wages and welfare capitalism, union membership actually declines. So during the Great Depression, the Wagner Act is going to come back and it's going to strengthen unions once again. Social Security Act, like I said, I kind of jumped ahead of myself. Be sure that you understand that that's the major piece of legislation from the second New Deal, okay? This happens in 1935 after the success of the 34 midterm elections. And again, this is meant to create that safety net to it's a modification of that Townsend plan. Very typical of FDR to take ideas from other people and make it uniquely his own. And the big thing, too, is while the government forces people to contribute to it and forces companies to contribute to it, understand that you basically pay in advance for your Social Security payments, right, or your retirement payments. It's not like oh, it's just a handout. I retire and get old and the government pays me for being old. No, you've actually already paid into it, right? This is one of the major issues when you talk about the solvency of Social Security based on the baby boom population, and how we have more older people. I think I explained this the other day. More older people and that are retiring and pulling from Social Security, and less young people paying into it. One of the big problems here is that everyone's already paid into it. You can't just say, well, we can't afford to pay you, because you owe people money, right? That's what they've been doing all these years. And so this is kind of part of the complicated issue with kind of fixing the Social Security. So it's not as simple as doing away with it. And anybody who suggests that, oh, we just do away with Social Security and privatize it, yeah, it's not that simple, okay? So just kind of keep that in mind. And also know that the Social Security Act is not a perfect response. There's lots of people that are left out of Social Security. It's domestic workers, a lot of African Americans who are contract labor. Doesn't address tenant farmers or anybody like that. So it's not a perfect system. But like I said, your big issue is going to be that people start paying taxes on Social Security in 1936. And while unemployment has improved, it's still double digits, okay? And so by making people lose a portion of their income and making businesses lose a portion of their profit margin, what you've essentially done is stop people's participation in the economy and stop businesses from having the opportunity to grow. And so that's going to be kind of a huge issue for why you have this recession in the middle of a depression. Recession meaning that unemployment starts to creep up and that kind of thing. We still don't reach the 1932 levels, but it does creep up and it kind of freaks everybody out. 1936 election, FDR is going to win pretty handily, even despite the criticisms that have been challenged at him. And his big focus after he wins in 1936 is going to be to try to address the groups that hadn't been targeted by the first and second New Deal. Now understand that after the 1936 election, things are starting to get crazy in Europe. Okay, this is about the time that Hitler's become Führer, the 1936 Olympics. I don't know if you guys, when that movie Race opened a week or two ago, there's a bunch of stuff. I saw a couple of different specials talking about the 1936 Olympics. Really kind of fascinating. To see, and one can argue that the 1936 Olympics are a big reason why so many Jews remained in Germany, because the Nazis basically kind of cleaned up their act for the 1936 Olympics because everybody was coming to Germany, and so they didn't want to appear too awful, and so they kind of back off of their, rounding up Jews and taking stuff away from them. And so many Jews interpreted that as, see, it's getting better. It's not going to be so awful. Well, then once the Olympics are over, right, the Nazis go right back at them. And, of course, part of this is helped, because you have Hitler kind of solidifying his position as Führer. So understand that that's kind of the global concept, that you also have Japan has become very kind of territorial. They're expanding into China. They're kind of beginning to put a lot of pressure in Asia. And so we've got these global situations. You've got Italy starts trying to go into North Africa, into Ethiopia, and Tunisia. And so these fascist countries are coming up beginning around 1935, 36, especially by 37. And you start to have these questions about territorial appeasement and all this kind of stuff. And so this is part of why after the 36 election, when you get to 37 and 38, well, there's definitely an emphasis with the New Deal on how do we handle these groups, these ill-clad, ill-housed, ill-clad, ill-nourished. And, the most famous quote for all progressives everywhere, the test of our progress is not whether we add more to the abundance of those who have much, it is whether we provide enough for those who have too little. And if there's a mission statement for any progressive of any stripe, that would be it, right? And so that's definitely a message of his second term, but understand that he's getting a little bit distracted by global considerations. And that's why what you see as far as the New Deal is concerned after the 36 election is not nearly as aggressive or anything else. One of the first things he'll have to deal with will be that recession that's happening because of the Social Security taxes. Now, one of the reasons why he wins in such a dominant fashion in 1936, and we actually kind of saw this a little bit in 32, but it's especially the case by 1936. And his dominant win in the face of critics from both the right and the left is going to be due to a new Democratic coalition, and I cannot overstate this enough. This is when the Democratic Party becomes the Democratic Party that you guys know today, okay? The party of minorities, the party of workers, the party of, trying to have this relationship where the government takes care of your economic needs but doesn't try to tell you how to live your life, right? This is where the modern Democratic Party comes from, and it's this Democratic coalition that builds on kind of a traditional support in the South based, and of course remember that Democratic support in the South goes back to like the Civil War, right? And the Redeemer Democrats and all that kind of stuff. So there's some confusion, some existential confusion for Southern Democrats, because you're going to have some people that are Democrats in the vein of populism, or Democrats who are blacks who are able to still vote in the South, which is getting harder and harder in the 1930s. So you're going to have those Democrats, and then you're going to have people that vote Democrat, well, because their family has always voted Democrat, and they would as soon die as vote for Republicans because that was the party of Lincoln. And there's still people in the South in the 1930s that think that way. Okay, so you want to be sure that you're kind of keeping that in mind. So you have some traditional support in the South. Now, one of the things that will happen, not during FDR's administration, but with Truman, who will replace FDR, is he will start to lose some of these Southern Democrats, the old school Democrats, because they'll start to be upset about racial integration. And so one of the trends that begins to happen in the late 40s, going all the way through the 50s and 60s, is this transition of the South from Democrats, i.e. Redeemer Democrats, to Republicans. Okay? So that should tell you a whole lot about our current political situation, right? So one of the reasons why the South is solidly Republican now is due to race, guys. It's racial concerns. It's Brown v. Board. It's the Civil Rights Act. And that's an uncomfortable truth for Republicans, right? This is why Republicans are struggling to kind of make that connection that we're not really racist, because part of why the South becomes Republican is because these Redeemer Democrats that under FDR had kind of an uncomfortable truce with kind of the Democratic Party. They didn't like integration, but FDR managed to not upset them too much because he made sure that with the Social Security Act, not too many blacks were covered. He made sure that hiring programs in the South had a preference towards whites, right? So there's kind of this, and this is one of the criticisms of FDR's New Deal, is that he was so concerned about maintaining his stronghold in the Deep South that his policies did not extend as far to minorities as they could have, because he knew he could only push these Deep South Democrats so far before they'd back off, and they'd be like, we're out of here, right? And so you've kind of got this interesting dance that happens with FDR. How do I keep Democrats on board and not make them mad over racial issues? Now, when you get to Truman, when you get to LBJ, they don't care. They don't have those nuances, right? And this is why you're going to shed Southern Democrats from the Democratic Party. So just, interesting little political science there. So you still have during the 1930s Democratic support in the South. It's very traditional. You're going to have big cities because the jobs programs are going to be very popular. The direct relief programs are going to be very popular, and workers are going to find that FDR is very friendly to them thanks to the Wagner Act. Black Americans for the first time will switch parties. Of course, they've been in the Deep South. They've been largely kind of alienated from the voting process. But remember, we've had the Great Migration of blacks moving up north, moving into the big cities. And because the jobs programs, particularly up north, were more favorable to black employment, many blacks begin to switch to the Democratic Party because their attitude is, what have the Republicans done for us lately? And by 1930, they've done nothing. They've done zero, zilch, nada. Okay? All those years since the Compromise of 1877, right? We've seen the Republicans basically ignoring racial issues, ignoring all of that kind of stuff. Teddy Roosevelt, even though he invited Booker T. Washington to the White House, He doesn't ever really fulfill any promises to the black community. And certainly in the 1920s, you see the Republicans are way more concerned about making money than they are anything else. And so blacks will abandon the Republican Party pretty much permanently, right? And so you're going to see that that they will go drift towards the Democratic Party, particularly up north, where they're not as intimidated from the voting process. And some of this too is, you can thank Eleanor Roosevelt, right? Part of this Democratic coalition is due to her efforts during his first term, where she travels, she reaches out to these groups, and as First Lady, she can go walk into Harlem and visit with black people in a way that Franklin Roosevelt couldn't have without facing a great deal of criticism. Now, she faces criticism too, and she doesn't, we're not talking about just blacks. We're talking about, women, orphans, coal miners, any kind of oppressed group. She's very much involved in that. It's part of her efforts that make people feel like Franklin Roosevelt is listening to their concerns. Especially if you're black, he may not be able to do as much as he wants to because, well, it's 1930s America, but he is hearing what the problems are. And so that makes people feel like there's a connection there. And like I said, that's largely due to Eleanor. Immigrants, laborers, farmers like FDR. Of course, tenant farmers, probably not as much because they're actually facing unintended consequences due to the AAA and the Farm Credit Administration and stuff. But tenant farmers probably aren't voting anyways, right? So the fact that he doesn't have a lock on them probably doesn't matter. But the land-owning farmers, the ones that actually own property, they like Franklin Roosevelt because they're getting paid to not grow anything, right? They're getting access to mortgage restructuring, so they're doing pretty well. And so we're going to see where FDR is going to create a black cabinet. He's going to have an unofficial group of advisors. One of them is Philip Randolph is going to be one of the guys that's going to have a real direct connection with FDR. And again, this is part of why the black community will really support FDR and the Democrats, because they feel like they're at least getting to express their concerns. And then, of course, FDR is also famous for having the first female cabinet member in Frances Perkins as Secretary of Labor. And Frances Perkins is an old school progressive, worked in the settlement house movement, was big with working with unions and all that kind of stuff. And so it's kind of interesting. Notice that he didn't try to fight lynching, which was one criticism that he faces from the black community. Why aren't you doing more to stop make lynching a federal crime? Because in the 1930s, it was not a federal crime. It was a state crime. And if you're in Mississippi, you're a white guy, you're not going to get charged for lynching anybody. So that's going to be an issue. He does sign an executive order forcing equal pay for black Americans. And we'll definitely see that as we move into World War II, he starts doing certain things, whether it's not integration of the military, but with having black forces fighting and that kind of thing. So you have some baby steps there. If you're pulling this up at home or later on, you can pull up Eleanor Roosevelt and Marian Anderson. One of the things that really kind of gets some political cachet for Roosevelt, especially as you're going into the 1940 election, is going to be that Eleanor Roosevelt basically rejects her membership in the Daughters of the American Revolution, which is especially in Washington, D.C., is going to be a significant women's political group, right? Because they won't let Marian Anderson sing. Marian Anderson was a black opera singer. And they would not let her perform in a Daughters of the American Revolution, Liberty Hall, or whatever that was called. And so she basically writes this letter that says, people are repulsive, and I reject my membership. And so it's really kind of takes a stance on racism and discrimination in a way that makes Franklin look good, even though he doesn't actually have to do anything, right? You're going to see the Indian Reorganization Act of 1934. Again, we're going to have another group. American Indians, if you remember from the Aaron Huey video, they had been horribly, their conditions were pretty bad. Now, this does not do away with the boarding school process that's still around, but you do see some attempts to begin to turn control of Indian land back over to the Indian tribes. and understand that this process begins in 1934, kind of has another improvement in the 1950s, has another improvement in the 1970s. And it's not until you have the American Indian movement of the 1970s, and you basically have the Indian Civil Rights Act, which is, I don't remember the year, 1976-ish, is when they really kind of step out of managing Indian affairs. But this is kind of the beginning of that trend of changing American Indian policies. And then women, of course, become very active in the Democratic Party. Remember, women had always been very progressive. And when the Democratic and Republican wings had progressive wings, they could really pick based on that. But when you start to get into the 1920s, right, the Republicans are so in control, and by the 1920s, there's no more progressive Republican, right? Those have gone away. Those have drifted to the Progressive Party, which is basically a meaningless party in the 1930s, right? So women in the, after you get to FDR, women are going to be attracted to the Democratic Party if they're remotely progressive at all. And typically because, these are going to be the women who are active in jobs and in education and that kind of thing. Now, you're still going to have fundamentalist women that are probably going to support the Republican Party, but there again, the question is, if you're a fundamentalist, are you going to be embracing the vote, right? And in some cases, women would, but it's not really until you get to the 1980s that you see conservative women advocating for fundamentalism and family values and political participation at the same time. So prior to the 1980s, a woman who's politically active is probably most likely to be Democrat, because women who would tend to be Republican are probably not going to be politically active. And some of this, too, is going to lead to, because of the economic conditions, the desertion rates, all that kind of stuff. You're going to see that Mexican Americans are really kind of the one sad story, or Hispanics in general, not just Mexican Americans, but predominantly Mexican Americans. You'd seen an increase, remember, in the early 1900s thanks to the Mexican Civil War, and instability thanks to dollar diplomacy and all that kind of stuff, where people, Hispanics, had moved into the southern part of the United States. Well, thanks to the Great Depression, we start deporting a lot of Hispanics, right, because we don't want the job competition. And so the 1930s are not known for being particularly attentive to Hispanic civil rights. And in fact, that's going to be one of the things that will lay the groundwork for somebody like Cesar Chavez. Some of his experiences in the 1930s with deportation are going to be part of why, with migrant farm workers in the 1960s and 70s, he's going to advocate for boycotts and sit-ins and all that kind of stuff, because that was his childhood experience. Now, once World War II starts, we're going to invite Hispanics back into the country because we desperately need people to help us with agricultural labor and with industrial labor. And so we'll kind of create a special program called the Bracero Program during World War II. But in the 1930s, right, Hispanic rights are not high on our list of consideration. And because they're not a significant minority at this point, right, their voting participation is less valuable. That won't matter until after World War II. Rural Electrification Administration that was brought in during the Second New Deal is incredibly important. It takes some of that hydroelectric power that's being created and finds a way to distribute it all over the South, okay? And again, this is part of that change in the South going back to the colonial period where the South was mired in agriculture and just refused to get out of it. Like, didn't want to have to industrialize. The Great Depression is going to break that, right? It's still going to take a few decades before we really see the difference. But when we talk about the transition in the 1980s of the South into basically an industrial center, and what most textbooks acknowledge is a migration back south, okay, from up north, that's going to be made possible by electrification, hydroelectric power, industrialization that has its beginning in the New Deal and has its beginning in World War II preparations and industrialization. So be sure you kind of know that. We have a lot more interest in creating hydroelectric power for California, Nevada, and Arizona. California in particular is experiencing a growth period in the 1930s. This is the golden age of Hollywood, and that is part of it. But part of it, too, is California is a region that's not being impacted by the ecological devastation of the Dust Bowl, right? And because California has a more diverse economy, the problems with the agricultural sector are not seen as much. And so California has a little different kind of experience during the Great Depression, and if we were in California, we would go into that in more detail. Just know that there's going to be a huge need to create more hydroelectric power there and maintain water supply. And if you know anything about current events, we know that currently, right, California is dealing with some major ecological problems, right? They're struggling with water supply. They have periods of rolling blackouts. They haven't had those in a couple of years. But every now and then they'll start to have an electrification problem. They're having lots of problems with ecological damage thanks to the natural gas and the oil industry. I was watching something this weekend about how in California, right, we tend to forget, we think of California as being a bunch of Birkenstocks and hippies, right, and political advocates, right? And what you have in California, the third largest oil and gas producer. And so there's lots of ecological damage happening in California because of the oil and gas industry. So it's just kind of interesting, especially if you're interested in the environment and stuff. So all of this electrification and water supply and stuff is going to allow for the western territories to begin to experience urbanization in a way that the eastern cities have been experiencing for some time. Someplace like Denver had always had some degree of urbanization. Someplace like San Francisco has had urbanization. But when you start talking about cities in Wyoming or Utah or Iowa, right, it's not going to be until you have this access to power and water supply that you're really going to enable people to move there and really start a business and a life there. Some of the last reforms of the New Deal are going to be the National Housing Act. That's a direct response to the Appalachian area. And seeing the conditions that the Appalachians lived in. Those are the mountains along like Tennessee and that kind of stuff. That area was incredibly poor. And you know, a lot of those people ended up working in coal mines, had very difficult conditions. A lot of those companies did that company housing, company store, company script stuff. Terrible educational opportunities. And so really, Eleanor really takes to Franklin Roosevelt, we've got to do something about this particular region of the country. So if I have any Hunger Games fans, right, one of the areas that, the area that what's her face Mockingjay, what's her name? Katniss, thank you. I don't know why I couldn't pull that out of my head. I was like, like Jennifer Lawrence. But anyways, one of the Katniss's district is perceived as being kind of an Appalachian area. So just kind of give you a context. So if you think about Hunger Games and kind of the way that, especially in the first book, it kind of describes that area, think that, but a little bit worse. And that would give you kind of a mental picture of what 1930s Appalachia was like. And so you definitely see that they start trying to create this National Housing Act to help the really working poor and those people who are mired in poverty. And so you start to have low-income housing being created. You have the Farm Security Administration that's meant to help alleviate the unintended consequence of the AAA. Now remember, the AAA had been declared unconstitutional, but not until it had displaced a lot of tenant farmers. And so the idea was what we could do is provide a way for a tenant farmer to get a low-interest loan so they could buy their own farm. Again, are we sure we want to do that if we've had agricultural overproduction and the agricultural market is still kind of, fluctuating? But they're trying to go back and fix some of these problems, right? So the Farm Security Administration is intended to do that. However, by the time you get to 1936, Congress, Congress isn't so sure they want to appropriate a ton of money for that. And by the time you get to the 1938 midterm election, you actually have the Republicans making some gains in Congress, and that's really going to slow reforms down. And the reason Republicans are making gains is because the Depression is still going on in 1937, 1938, right? And 1937 is kind of the worst period of that recession within a depression. And then they start shoving a bunch of money back into the economy with jobs programs and stuff like that. And so you see by late 1938-39, things are starting to improve, but not until the Republicans make some progress. Now, they're still not in control of Congress, But it definitely sends the message that that the American public wasn't so sure that they liked what was going on. I'll go away. So you definitely see that the Farm Security Administration doesn't have the appropriations it needs. Fair Labor Standards Act in 1938 finally ends child labor. Finally. 1938, child labor is illegal. You also have the establishment of the 40-hour work week. And so this becomes some of these labor standards that we had seen developing thanks to some, if you think back to Woodrow Wilson creating the 8-hour workday for railroad workers and some of the pressure from progressive reformers to end child labor. We'd seen some improvement in those areas, but now it's actually finally legislated, okay, thanks to the Fair Labor Standards Act. And so that's kind of what we're going to see as being kind of the last gasp of the New Deal, right? And once you get to 1938, in addition to the Republicans gaining some seats in Congress, Europe is falling apart, okay? The invasion of Poland begins in September of 1939. 1938 is the year where, Hitler's, annexing Austria. He's demanding the Danzig port. He wants all this kind of unification of territories that have been taken from Germany thanks to the Treaty of Versailles. And so people are just way more concerned with what's beginning to happen overseas. And there's more of a sense of, nothing seems to really be fixing this depression. Like everything's hopeless a little bit. I don't want to say hopeless because I think that removes from the New Deal the sense of hope that FDR is working on it. Because I still think even in 1938, most Americans believed FDR was working on the problem. But just understand that that 1938, you begin to see kind of, depending on what documents you look at, you do start to see people changing their priorities a little bit. All right, we're going to backtrack a little bit. Talk specifically about the court packing scheme. I mentioned the Supreme Court stepping in 1935 and declaring two major pieces of legislation unconstitutional, the NRA and the AAA. And the foundation for that decision is that the government cannot tell people where to shop, they cannot endorse certain companies, and they cannot tell farmers what to grow. Okay? The government's not allowed to do that. The government can regulate things, but the government cannot come right out and say, yes, you can, no, you can't. Okay? Unless, of course, I can make a snarky comment. They get away with that sometimes. It depends. But, this is the foundation of the Supreme Court decision. Well, this makes Franklin Roosevelt very upset, right? He feels like the Supreme Court, and this is a Supreme Court that's dominated by conservatives, people that were put on the Supreme Court by somebody other than him. Matter of fact, I don't think don't quote me on this, but I want to say it's not till his second term that he really gets to have a shot at putting somebody new on the Supreme Court. Because Earl Warren, who is the guy that kind of leads this civil rights charge, he's one of the guys that gets put on either by FDR or by Truman, but it's right there, kind of the end of this period. But I'm almost positive. I'd have to Google that. I can't quite access that in my brain. But what you have is Franklin feeling like the Supreme Court is pushing an agenda that the American public doesn't endorse. And guys, we hear that same argument right now, right? The Republicans in Congress use this argument to justify why they won't nominate anybody for the Supreme Court. They're saying that it's up to the American public. Yes, ma'am? Mm-hmm. Tom? Yes. He is. You're not going with BPA, Danny? Huh?
Not today.
He said not today. When are you?
Tomorrow.
Bye-bye. All right, so that same argument that the Supreme Court should not push their own agenda. The Supreme Court should support the will of the people. You heard this after the gay marriage ruling, right? That there were people in the country that didn't, of course, I don't know how they justify that since you had a portion of the country that was okay with it. I don't know how you say that, but this was the argument that was said, that we have an activist Supreme Court that's going beyond their constitutional rights, their constitutional powers. Except they're not, right? In fact, I would argue that when Congress when either the president or Congress gets mad at the Supreme Court for their abuse, and I'm using air quotes on the recording, for their abuse of constitutional power, it's probably not an abuse. They're probably just mad that the Supreme Court doesn't agree with them. That's my observation. You certainly see that being the case with FDR and his court packing scheme, because he feels like the Supreme Court is intentionally thwarting the will of the people because they represent conservative business interests. Okay? Now here's the thing. That basically the Supreme Court is correct. The government can't come out in a democratic, free market economy and support directly one business or tell farmers what to grow. They can't do that. Okay? So they're correct. Now, I get where FDR is coming from too. That basically that the will of the people was that we take action and that they should do that. But if you look at the pieces of legislation, if you look at the NRA, if you look at the AAA, what you see is that those two policies have unintended consequences. And if you think about the NRA and the fact that it disadvantaged small businesses, if you think about its really lackluster performance for the brief amount of period that it was in operation, if you look at the AAA and its impact on tenant farmers, it was badly crafted legislation. It needed to go back. It needed to be redone. But FDR feels like this is an attack on the New Deal, an attack on what the American public wants. And so he's going to turn to Congress in 1936, and he's going to say, we need to restructure the Supreme Court. Haven't you heard that lately? Okay? We need to change the way the Supreme Court's created. It's not relevant to today. Okay? And basically what happens is that everybody, Democrats included, go, what? Are you nuts? We can't restructure the Supreme Court. He comes up with a plan. He wants to increase the number of Supreme Courts, and that when they reach the age of 70, they're forced to retire. Now here, yes, right? That they're going to be forced to retire at the age of 70, and if they refuse to retire, that the president in charge at that time can then nominate somebody else onto the Supreme Court to kind of balance out their vote. It's crazy, right? And so he wants to increase the size of the Supreme Court, and that basically what that would do is like overnight would give him like 4 nominations to the Supreme Court, 4 or 5, something like that. And I think it was 4. And so basically everyone says no, we can't do that. That's too much. And so when you hear people after the gay marriage ruling, when they were mad about the activist Supreme Court, and they say this after Brown v. Board too. How dare the Supreme Court? They're abusing federal power. No, they're not. They're interpreting the law according to the Constitution. And here's the unfortunate thing: that knife will cut both ways. Sometimes it makes liberals and progressives crazy, and sometimes it makes conservatives crazy. We just have to accept that sometimes the Supreme Court's going to make a decision we don't agree with, okay? And we don't like it. And that's what it's supposed to do, okay? That's why it exists. And to create a system where a president is somehow given too much power over the Supreme Court can be bad. Now, there's criticisms about the way the Supreme Court is structured now. I've heard several things here lately talking about we should have age limits, that it's ridiculous that Scalia was 79 and people were shocked that he died. He was in bad health. That maybe we should have retirement ages to have kind of constant fresh blood coming into the Supreme Court. And those are not horrible suggestions, but understand that that's very different from the way our founding fathers created it. So unless we're willing to go redo the entire system, to me, you can't just redo the Supreme Court and then say, oh, well, the other 2 branches get to stay the same. We either need to redo the whole thing, or we need to keep it the way it is, in my humble opinion. And you can take that for what it's worth. But at the end of the day, I want you to see there's a consistency with the Supreme Court argument about the power of the Supreme Court. Are they a bunch of old men making decisions that don't support the will of the people? What is the checks and balances system? The power of the president to nominate people to the Supreme Court. And like I said, now we've got a Senate that has flat out refused to even talk about a nominee. in a way that's not even remotely constitutional. And nobody's even like mad that the Senate's doing this. Like we should be going, you people are not supporting the Constitution, right? Because they're not. And you know, it's not like it's October and we're a month away from the election, right? I mean, we're almost, yeah, anyways. Let it go, Carrie. All right, so you have this whole notion about the checks and balances system of the president having that role. So what will happen is the Democrats will split over this issue, so it'll actually kind of weaken FDR's hold over the Democratic Party. In fact, one could argue, had World War II not begun to develop in Europe, this might have had a bigger impact on FDR than we think. It really does kind of fracture his party a little bit because people feel like he is making a power grab. And understand that by the time you get to 36, 37, 38, there's been some criticisms that he's being a little bit too power hungry, that there's too much executive power and he's restructuring the government too much. And so what will happen is that the Senate will basically say, no, FDR, we're not going to sign off on this. So he doesn't get his court packing scheme. The Supreme Court does begin to make some decisions later on that are more favorable to the New Deal. Like the Wagner Act is upheld, and there's one other piece, Social Security Act is upheld. Now, is that because of the threat of a court packing scheme? I don't think so. I mean, maybe that had something to do with it. They could kind of test the winds and say, okay, gee, generally we upset everybody. I think what's more likely is that the legislation with the Social Security Act was crafted better, and that when you have bad legislation that gets passed, this is one of the questions about the Affordable Care Act, right? Where the Supreme Court upholds certain aspects of it, but I think and again, take this for what it's worth, my interpretation of the Affordable Care Act is what parts they continue to support are because they have to continue to support Social Security, right? So they support the fact that the government can basically tell you you have to do something or you pay a tax, or they can tell you they can tax you over something. But the government can't force states to participate with it. So I think that's why the Supreme Court has had this wishy-washy ruling on the Affordable Care Act, because I think fundamentally the Affordable Care Act is poorly crafted legislation, in my humble opinion. So yes, you're going to have the court packing scheme is going to hurt FDR a little bit, and it might have hurt him more, except, you're going to have Hitler coming to power. And in fact, the court packing scheme is another reason for why the Republicans are going to gain seats in Congress in 1938. So you have this cartoon of the Supreme Court battle. This one's popped up on, it was back, popped from the tax test. I don't know about the STAR test yet. So who knows? Obviously, it's in their bank of cartoons. But it shows you the legislative branch, the executive branch, and the judicial branch. Surprise move by the president urges sweeping reorganization of courts. The Roosevelt recession, again, that's going to hurt his reputation. We've already touched on that a little bit. And part of this is because, in addition to the Social Security Administration, by the time you get to 1936, because unemployment had started to improve, or decline, rather. Unemployment's getting smaller and smaller. More people are working. So the Secretary of Treasury, Morgenthau, who is a little more conservative than FDR, thinks this is time to start gradually scaling back some of these jobs programs. And of course, again, this is happening at the same time as Social Security taxes come out. And so that's going to start to freeze up the economy. And again, what you see is Roosevelt responding to his critics, okay? So the Roosevelt recession, this is where we talk about these economic theories of supply-side economics and Keynesian economics. And these things matter because we still talk about them today. You will talk about them next year in economics, okay? So this is your mini lesson on supply-side and Keynesian. We've already talked about supply-side going back to the 1920s. And supply-side is the idea that we need to put money in the hands of the consumers by having fewer taxes. And if people have fewer taxes to pay, then they go out and they buy more stuff. And if we buy more stuff, then businesses have to make more stuff, which means they expand and grow their business, right? If you couple that with tax cuts for businesses, then businesses have more money to spend to expand their business. Supply-side economics does work, okay? There's nothing wrong with this theory, okay? a valid economic theory as long as it's managed correctly. In other words, businesses have to expand with their tax cuts. Consumers have to spend with their tax cuts. And if consumers and businesses are scared because the economic circumstances aren't quite right, then they're not going to spend what they're saving. They're going to be paying off debt, they're going to be putting in a savings account, and that does not ultimately stimulate the economy. Okay? So supply side economics is a great tool to kind of, the way I always describe it, it's like a shot of adrenaline in the economy. If your economy is being a little sluggish and you want to kind of jumpstart it, then a little supply side economics for a short period of time is a great thing. However, just like if you were to give yourself adrenaline over too long a period, it can have bad health consequences. Supply side economics, unchecked over a long period, can have some unfortunate consequences, right? Because people are going to start to speculate. You're going to start to have expansion of businesses based on, we got to keep expanding. We can't, because if we stop expanding, we're going to collapse, right? And so you're going to have expansion when there shouldn't be expansion. It's going to tend to overheat the economy a little bit, especially if interest rates are low. And if you start to have people maxed out on debt, supply side economics is not the way to go, because then you give people tax cuts and they're just paying off their debt. They're not trying to even spend anymore. So supply side economics has to be used carefully. Similarly, Keynesian economics has to be used carefully too. Keynesian economics is kind of this idea that the government primes the pump. And we saw that a little bit when FDR comes in. After the Roosevelt recession in 1936-37, you really see this argument for Keynesian economics being, because part of what these people that are pro-deficit spending will say is that our concern about the deficit came at the wrong time, and that because we stopped priming the pump of the economy, everything seized up. Well, it's not quite as simple as all that, right? Keynesian economics says that when you have a recession, when you have rising unemployment and people are starting to have trouble participating in the economy, what you must do is create jobs. You must stimulate economic growth. And you do that by the government having projects, right? Let's build a road, let's build a new highway system, let's build schools, let's build national parks, let's do something like that, and we'll put people to work doing these things, okay? That's Keynesian economics. Keynesian economics can also be partnered with relief programs, direct relief, food stamps, all that kind of stuff. And that is absolutely a valid way to respond to a recession. We certainly saw that after the 2008 recession. This is what we see happening with the New Deal. The government creating jobs, putting money into the economy to kind of get people like through this hump, right? That only the government has the credit rating and has the credit resources to basically kickstart the economy. And that is true. Yes, you can. The issue with Keynesian economics is that this concern about the deficit is not completely invalid, right? If you carry too much deficit, that can be an issue because then you can never pay it down. And the part of Keynesian economics that critics often forget is that Keynes actually said during periods of prosperity, you have to start paying back your debt. You cannot just let the deficit continue to grow and ignore that you need to pay this off. So basically, Keynes argues that you have kind of a responsive economy that includes both aspects of Keynesian, prime the pump economics, and a little bit of supply side when needed. And then when things are really good, you focus all your efforts in paying down your deficit, right? And so you have kind of this flexible response to the economy. Here's the problem. We don't do that, right? We want to be, it's all supply side, all tax cuts, all business growth. And then when that goes badly, we need to have all these programs and all this spending, right? Here's the other problem that's happened since World War II, right? And we can talk, when we get to the Cold War, we'll talk about the role of military spending. Military spending has become the go-to government program, right? Let's spend on our military. Let's build new planes, new helicopters, new weapons, new stuff like that. Well, the problem with that is, when you build new planes, new weapons, new bombs, are you really creating infrastructure? If we build a new highway system, we've created a highway system that has infrastructure that helps Americans, that facilitates business growth, facilitates transportation. Think Continental Railroad, right? So we've now created an infrastructure that improves things. When we invest in school systems, we create an infrastructure that improves things. When you spend on military, you're not creating an infrastructure. You're creating a consumable product. I always compare it to, think about a household budget, right? If you take your money and you go into debt going out to eat, right, and then you start paying on that debt, what are you paying off? You're paying on food you've already digested, right? That's not a good use of money. Many people now, today, argue that automobiles are not a good use of money. That's why you see the rise in car leases, right? Because people say, why am I paying for a vehicle that I want to trade in 3 years anyways, and then I'm upside down on it, right? Because vehicles have gotten so expensive. And they're a consumable product. They don't hold their value. We use them and wear them out, right? And this is where real estate comes in. Real estate is perceived as a solid investment because it's supposed to hold its value, which is true unless you have a speculation bubble, right? Which you had going into 2008, and some would argue we're starting to have again because of low interest rates and because the government has fallen to the same old standard of speculation equals economic growth, and it doesn't, right? Economic growth, if you have businesses expanding, that's good. But if you have them expanding based on speculation, that's bad. Okay? So again, these are lots of complicated economic theories. You'll get a whole more in-depth next year when you take economics. But understand, especially as we're going into an election year, you're going to hear politicians talking about these concepts. And these concepts are incredibly important as you become adults. And you start thinking about, even if it's your household budget, like people would argue that student loans are, to put it in a kind of, in this conversation, a Keynesian approach, right? You're going into debt because you're going to invest in something that will ultimately create more wealth than it costs, right? Whereas buying a car is not, right? Because it's going to be consumed, right? And that kind of thing. So this kind of gives you some ideas like how to maybe wrap your brain around these notions of supply-side economics and Keynesian economics. And in fact, it was not until I took a class specifically on the Great Depression that I really actually understood macroeconomics. And I don't know why, like when I took macroeconomics, I couldn't figure it out. But then when I took a class on the Great Depression, I was like, oh, this is what they're talking about. Like I had an actual historical context that made sense to me. So you have this economy collapsing because of the recession, and unemployment surges back. Most places it's not quite as bad, but it's certainly certain elements of the economy will see double-digit or increasing double-digit unemployment. So FDR will then turn back to the jobs program, the PWA, the WPA, to prime the pump. Argues for Keynesian economics. In fact, and I don't know if this cartoon's coming up next. There's a cartoon that shows Franklin Roosevelt pulling a rabbit out of a hat and it's suspending, right? This has always worked for me. That's where that cartoon comes in. Congress, essentially, like I said, 1938, you see Congress, Republicans gaining some seats back in there. Democrats, some of your deep Southern Democrats, the ones that are the Redeemer type, not the progressive type, they're going to start to be less compliant with FDR's policies, in part because some of these things, the tenant farmers, the Farm Security Administration, they don't like the fact that some of those farmers are getting some low interest loans, that kind of thing. And so you start to see that all of these things are going to slow down the New Deal, and the New Deal is not going to be really doing anything new after 1938, okay? So once you hit 1939, it's not that the New Deal's over, because the programs are still in place and they're still functioning, but you don't have any new programs. So everything that happens is primarily in that first term of office, with a little bit happening in the second term. And then it really, like I said, World War II, the backlash in 1938 because of the recession and the court packing scheme, and the fact that the racist Democrats don't like this new coalition. Oh, there's the cartoon. And so I think that these are all some interesting trends to kind of note historically as to how the New Deal changes. And what would have happened in 1940 had World War II not broken out? I don't know. We could speculate all day long. Would that have, would FDR have even run again? Understand that he will run again in 1940 because at this point, there is not an official law that says you can only serve 2 terms. In fact, it's because of FDR that we have the 22nd Amendment, 2 terms, 22nd, that says you can only a president can only serve 2 consecutive terms. At most, they can serve for 10 years. They could finish out one president's term and then win twice in their own right, and that's the most they could do. Now, what happens if you're like Teddy Roosevelt and you basically serve all of that guy's term? I'm assuming means that they can't run the second time, based on the interpretation of the Constitution. I think it's pretty clear cut. I don't think there's a loophole there. Not that we've ever gotten that far, because they run twice and they're done. And then like in the case of LBJ, by the time he got to when he would run for his second term in 1968, he was so incredibly unpopular he chose not to run at all. So you definitely have those things beginning to change. FDR will win in 1940, in large part because of World War II. Because Americans, for the most part, and of course some of this is a happy occurrence as well. And maybe by 1940, you've seen the effect of Keynesian economics and the fact that the economy is starting to turn around by 1940. But also understand that by 1940, the U.S. is supplying Britain and the Allies with weapons, which at that point is primarily Britain. With weapons, and so the military industry is beginning to grow and expand, and because of the threat globally, Republicans and Southern Democrats are signing off on appropriations to, create, military products, and so all of these things are going to create more jobs. So it's very difficult to really analyze what would have happened in 1940 had we not had World War II, because the Great Depression really begins to end by 1940. It's not officially over really until you have what is perceived as the full employment of 1942. But you certainly see conditions being very different in 1940 than they were in 1938. In 1938, we have the effects of the Roosevelt recession. In 1940, those effects are gone, right? And so, the economic circumstances are very different, but the economic circumstances are very different in part because of maybe Keynesian economics, but also because of military spending. And does the Keynesian economics justify the military spending? So there's lots of kind of things you can analyze about that. So just be sure that you're aware that he runs in 1940. He runs again in 44, wins because we're at the end of World War II. Nobody wants to change presidents then. But then he dies in April of 45, and Truman takes over for him. Legacy of the New Deal, increased federal power over the economy. Again, we have this new relationship of the government with economics and new relationship of the government with people. The idea of a broker state, that our government mediates between groups, between consumers and producers, between workers and owners, between races, between the poor and the rich, that the government is in the middle of these relationships. And this is new. This is in a new way than we've ever seen, even with the progressives. The progressives like to regulate things, but they did not insinuate themselves in between different groups of people. And so that's where the New Deal is very different. Again, the safety net concept. And then, of course, congressional power is going to be much weaker under FDR. FDR is a strong president, a strong executive office, and we've talked about that throughout last fall and the spring, how you have some presidents who are very strong executives and some presidents who are very weak executives. And so you have this ebb and flow of power between the legislative branch and the executive branch, with that pesky little judicial branch doing its own thing periodically. And so the big question, and we still ask that today, how much should the government be involved? What should the government be doing? What is appropriate involvement? What is appropriate responsibility? Should the government be worried about putting us all on a shelf and creating equal opportunity? Or should the government simply be saying, okay, there's certain things we're not going to let happen. If you get homeless, you can access certain funds. If you're starving, you can access food stamps. If you, this, that, and the other thing, right? What is the role of the government here? And I think one of the big problems our country has had, really since the New Deal, is we can never quite make up our mind. We look at this New Deal kind of big government concept, and we like it sometimes. And then we get tired of it, and we want to go away from it. And then something bad happens, and we go back to it. And then we get tired of it again. And so we never have this kind of consistent And because of the way the political system is structured, right, it tends to be all one or all the other. And so that's one of kind of the unique issues with American politics. And so just be sure you're aware of the legacy of the New Deal and kind of the overall impact that it has. Lasts approximately 8 years. Like I said, by the time you get to the end of 1938, nothing really new is happening. The programs are still in place, but they're not new, and they're not. And by the time you get to 39 and 40, it's very hard to distinguish between what is a New Deal program and what is a response to global tensions. And so trying to tease out like which is more responsible for the improving economic conditions at home becomes much more difficult. So doesn't bring prosperity, but does help American morale. Most Americans believe in the New Deal. And it does begin to promote a gradual recovery that's ultimately pushed over the top by World War II preparations. The middle class is going to be most helped due to the New Deal, which is the lesson we can probably take for today, because one of the reasons I would suggest to you that we struggle with true economic rebound since 2008 is we've never addressed the concerns of the middle class, right? Even if you look at economic indicators now, right, the wealthiest individuals, the far upper middle class, have benefited, but your middle class has not benefited. The people that make, 100 to 150,000 a year as a family are not benefiting, and they're the ones that are paying the most, right? They don't have enough money to hide, but they make too much money to get any help. And so that group of people is really struggling, and we're not addressing that. And that's where most Americans end up falling. So that's an issue. You have kind of a limited welfare state, not a welfare state in the way that Europe was, but certainly more so than America had ever had. Some of your neediest groups are not going to be helped, so it's not perfect. It does maintain capitalism. In a period where you have communism and fascism as the viable alternatives. And you're going to have a state government that's much stronger than ever before. And again, notice that it finds that moderate course. Again, we have a new Democratic Party, thanks to the New Deal, the Democratic Coalition. And this idea of looking to the government for action, regulation, and stabilizing the economy. And moving away from the progressive tendency towards moralism. Alcohol is bad for you, so we're gonna oppose it. You have to be educated. You have to be educated this way. We're gonna Americanize you. You kind of see a rejection of that and an acceptance of the government as having an economic partnership with the people. So I think it's a new type of progressivism. And also notice the 21st Amendment, 1933. Kind of a footnote, really, in the New Deal. By the time you get to 1933, most people are like, yeah, prohibition's been a fail. Led to increased crime, leads to, people are drinking anyways. And so everyone realizes this hasn't worked out at all. So be sure you kind of know that. Here's some pictures of tenant farmers and sharecroppers, some of these groups that were most needy, that needed the most help, that get left out. Kind of a global context, dictatorships are emerging during the 1930s. Again, the economic situations, the post-World War I hangover, if you will, led to people. Many of these countries are relatively new. Soviet Union was a new, the reforms coming after between 1905 and 1917 that were meant to introduce kind of democratic reforms, were very new and unfamiliar to Russians. And this is going to pave the way for the Bolsheviks to take over. And it's Bolshevism that's going to make the United States all freaked out about communists, right? This is going to lead to the Red Scare after World War I. And you're going to see Stalin's going to solidify his power. Fascism, Italy is a relatively new country, inexperienced with democracy. They start to be affected by the global depression in the 1920s, and this is where Mussolini's going to come in, and he's going to be like, I have an answer. We'll strengthen the military, and we'll spend all this money on the military, and we'll have a national identity, and we'll be big and strong. Yes, exactly. Go Italy. And so then shortly after that, they decide to invade North Africa and all this kind of stuff.
Did they lose?
Huh?
Did they win or did they lose?
Initially, they got control of North Africa, but again, a lot of that's because they fund a lot of military expenditures in comparison with like Tunisia and Ethiopia, which are way far behind industrially. So it's kind of like bringing a gun to a knife fight. I mean, of course you're going to win, right? Now the problem is he can't sustain that, and he ends up having to mooch off of Germany for the most part. In fact, my husband has an interesting theory about that one of the real reasons why Germany loses World War II is because of the ineptness of Mussolini and the Italians, and how the Germans have to basically bolster this fascist regime up. So you have that. Germany, Weimar Republic, right at the end of 1918, the Kaiser escapes. You have a new democracy kind of created in Germany. The Weimar Republic struggles, has constant changes in leadership, lots of turmoil, lots of economic problems. And because you have such high unemployment in Germany, what's going to happen is Hitler's going to be able to come in and he's going to do and similarly to Mussolini, I have an answer for you. We're going to be great. It's going to be fabulous. It's going to be awesome and terrific, and I have a plan. You just need to trust me. And I'm being flippant, but don't take it that way. You need to be worried. I'm just saying. Okay. So, because that's absolutely what he does. Very loose plans and loose ideas, and says it's all going to be great and wonderful, and Germany was going to be great again, and they were going to be awesome, and it's all everybody else's fault why Germany's not as great as it once was. And people totally bought into it. And by the time they realize what they've bitten off, it's too late. He's Fuhrer, the Nazis are in control, and they're throwing people in jail who disagree with them. And I'm just saying. Yeah. We can talk about that more later. So Latin America is also dominated by dictators. China is a complete mess, right? China has taken down the emperor in the 1920s, replaced him with nationalist leadership, with Chiang Kai-shek, however you say his name, except they get invaded by Japan, and it's the communists in China that will actually successfully fight Japan because Kai-shek's nationalists are horribly corrupt, and that's a whole other side story. But again, this is kind of the ramification of American policy with China and the open door and kind of the chaos that's created in China because of all the trade and European and American influence. And then Kai-shek comes in, and he basically can't handle anything, and is completely corrupt and inefficient. A lot of the former emperor's kind of bureaucracy goes into the Nationalist Party, and the communists are the ones who are really able to actively take care of the people. These would be kind of the Boxer Rebellion kind of background. And in fact, that's going to shape a lot of what China's policies are going to be in the 40s and 50s, especially as the communists take over. So you have, and one of the interesting things, kind of a preview into the Cold War, the Chinese communists are very different from the Soviet communists. Stalin and his communism is a whole different thing. That's a little bit of an overstep. It's different in that Stalin is a mutation of communism. It is communist, but it's really what we call Stalinist, right? I mean, Stalin's a dictator, and he runs Soviet Union based on communist principles, but at the end of the day, he's a single dictator. China is more of a, even though you have Ho Chi Minh and all, not Ho Chi Minh, that's Vietnam, Chairman Mao, even though you have him kind of as a main leader, China's communist is more of a true communist country, and of course what we've seen in a modern context is that they've begun to economically adapt and embrace certain aspects of capitalism, even while maintaining the Communist Party control. And so Japan will invade China. That creates a lot of disruption. That starts in 1937. Last thing I'm going to touch on with my last 4 minutes or whatever, communism and fascism. Some basic things as we move into World War II that you need to understand that come from the 1930s. You've essentially got three political plans, okay? You've got democracy, i.e. democracy, and then in parentheses next to that capitalism, right? As embodied particularly by the United States, but also by Britain. And you definitely see in both the United States and Britain, and in this concept of democracy and capitalism, this is still a strong leader. You've got FDR, you've got Winston Churchill, you've got a larger, kind of more controlling government, kind of really kind of manipulating the economy. So it's not that you have zero government control, but democracy is definitely emerging as an ideology that countries can choose to follow. And that's an important concept to grasp as we move into the Cold War after World War II. The other two competing ideas that we have in the 1930s and 40s are going to be communism and fascism. In communism, you have this notion of a single party, okay? The party holds all the power. They are authoritarian. They set all the rules. They control the economy. They control businesses. They tell businesses what to make, what not to make. They tell farmers what to grow, what not to grow. You see the problems with the NRA and the AAA, right? They tell people what to do. They even tell you what jobs you have and all this kind of stuff, right? Very tightly controlled economy. And within this party, you're going to have, even though officially there's no class system, you have the ruling part of the party, and then you have everybody else. Everybody has to be a part of the Communist Party. There's no options, right? But if you move into leadership, you're going to have access to more stuff. You're going to have typically a strong leader. Early in the Soviet Union, it was Vladimir Lenin and Trotsky and Stalin. But once Lenin dies and Trotsky gets exiled, you basically just have Stalin. Stalin will be replaced by Khrushchev. And he'll be a little bit more of a strong leader, but what we'll see is that over time, this strong leadership fades away, and it reveals really kind of the train wreck that is Soviet communism. They often like to control through what we call hegemony, which is that term we talked about from imperialism, that influence. I'm going to control you and influence you, and you better do what I like or I'll send my troops in, right? Very much like the U.S. did with Cuba or with dollar diplomacy. That's how the Soviet Union likes to operate. They create a Comintern, which is a series of kind of like satellite states that they influence through hegemony. This will be even more important after World War II, but it does play a role a little bit going into World War II, and especially when you're talking about the division of Poland in 1939. That the Soviet Union wanted to kind of have a buffer zone and have this territory that they influenced. In contrast, you have fascism. Fascism is aggressive nationalism and expansion. This idea of our nation's the best. We're going to go conquer some territory. Our military is awesome, right? And, it's going to be fabulous and great and terrific. And this is often seen as the nation is more important than the individuals. Individuals serve the nation. There is room within fascism for you to be an individual as long as your individualism serves what the nation wants you to do. In other words, if you're a singer, you sing patriotic songs. If you're a doctor, you work for the military. If you're an industrialist, you make military products. Everything you do has to serve the nation, okay? Benito Mussolini is actually the first fascist leader, followed by Adolf Hitler, who kind of, takes the ball and becomes a better fascist than Mussolini. Japan is sort of a fascist nation, not quite as much so as the other two. One other thing, horribly anti-communist, right? They hate communists. They rely on private industry for military and economic expansion. There we go. All right, quiz on Friday. And that's pretty much it. I'll kind of cover this again as we introduce World War II and kind of revisit some of that, but you might just kind of stick that in your head. And that's pretty much it. If you're behind on anything, get caught up. Because the end of the grading period is the Friday after spring break.